Have you ever heard the kind of story that makes your stomach turn before your mind even catches up? The kind that feels like a secret, someone buried too deep. But the earth shifted, and now it's clawing its way back to the surface. It begins with a heartbeat, a tiny pulse, hidden inside another, a sound that should mean life, but here, it meant the collapse of everything we thought we understood about innocence. In 1939, in a forgotten corner of Peru, a 5-year-old girl named Lina Medina was brought to a hospital because her stomach had grown grotesquely round. The villagers thought it was a tumor. The doctors prepared their instruments, expecting to remove a mass. What they found instead was a child inside a child, a full-term fetus, alive, kicking, heartbeat steady. History calls it a medical mystery, the word they use to keep the mind from breaking under what it's really staring at. A biological impossibility that proved the human body can be corrupted far earlier than nature ever intended. You have to picture it, because that's the only way it becomes real. The sterile light of the operating room, the hum of an X-ray machine too primitive to lie, the shadow of a skull, tiny limbs curled inside another skeleton, half its size, a heartbeat inside a heartbeat. Science didn't have a name for it then, but nature did. Violation. Lina didn't cry, didn't speak. She sat silent while the world dissected her body like an exhibit. The doctors called it precocious puberty, a phrase clinical enough to sterilize horror. She had begun menstruating before age 2, they said. Her bones were that of an adult, her ovaries fully functional. But there's a darker question, one that medicine avoids like fire. How did a 5-year-old become pregnant? That's where history goes quiet. Too quiet. The police arrested her father first. Villagers said nothing. The case was dropped. No conviction, no explanation. And just like that, the world moved on, choosing curiosity over justice. Newspapers wrote about the miracle. Photographers lined up. Scientists called her the youngest mother in history. But beneath that title lies a truth no one dared to write. A secret buried under layers of denial. A 5-year-old gave birth in front of the world, and humanity shrugged. That's the real story. Not biology, not anomaly, but complicity. The silence of adults, institutions, and men who saw what they shouldn't and decided to call it fascinating instead of monstrous. When the surgery was over, the doctors stood in stunned silence. The baby was healthy, they said. A boy, 6 pounds, named Gerardo, after the doctor who delivered him. Even the naming was wrong. Ownership masked as compassion. The mother, still under anesthesia, didn't even know she'd survived childbirth. And when she woke, she didn't ask to see her baby. She only asked for her mother. What does that tell you? Instinct knows before intellect admits it. Something unspeakable had happened. That's how it begins. A single anomaly, transformed into a spectacle. But the real infection spread far beyond that hospital in Peru. It reached the hands of journalists, governments, and moral authorities who realized what could be done with stories like this. Stories that blur lines, erode empathy, and make people forget where horror ends and fascination begins. Because if the world could look at a 5-year-old mother and feel wonder instead of rage, then something fundamental in human morality had already been broken. This wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was a mirror, reflecting how institutions reframe atrocities as phenomena, how systems convert trauma into documentation. And while they called it medicine, it was exploitation. The press didn't just report it, they fed on it. Photos of a child in hospital sheets, headlines screaming, "Miracle of the Andes." It wasn't news. It was voyeurism wearing a lab coat. Lina Medina's body became a case study. Her pain became footnotes. And the world learned that when innocence bleeds, power doesn't intervene. It records. By the end of that year, the story was buried under new wars, new distractions. But the questions never died. They were buried alive. Who did it? Why was no one punished? How did an entire civilization turn a child's violation into a scientific curiosity? You're not supposed to ask those questions. You're supposed to believe the official story. Precocious puberty. But you and I both know, biology doesn't erase intent, and silence doesn't mean ignorance. It means permission. Stay here, because in the next descent, we're going to pull that silence apart, thread by thread, until what was hidden beneath the white coats, the cameras, and the headlines is revealed for what it really was, a ritual of control disguised as medicine. Now take a breath. You'll need it. The deeper we go, the more the light begins to lie. You think this story ended in a hospital room. It didn't. That was only where the wound was opened. The real damage came later, when the world decided what the truth should be. After the birth, the doctors said the child would live a normal life. That was the lie. Lina was 5 years old, but by the time she left the hospital, she was already an artifact, something owned. Her son, Gerardo, was registered as her brother. The papers erased the pregnancy, erased the crime, erased the evidence. What remained was a miracle headline, clean enough for the public to consume. The Peruvian government stayed silent. No investigation, no medical ethics inquiry, no search for justice. Why? Because admitting the truth would mean confessing failure, not just by a father or a village, but by the entire system that claimed to protect the innocent. So they buried it under bureaucracy. They called it a closed case. That's how corruption survives. Not in darkness, but in blinding light, hidden under official documentation and polite disbelief. You can hide anything behind enough paperwork. Decades later, researchers tried to reopen the story. They found the records heavily redacted, signatures missing, files mysteriously lost. One investigator claimed that the hospital archives were sanitized in the early 1940s by order of Lima's medical board. No one ever confirmed it, but you can feel the fingerprints of authority all over it. This wasn't just about a child. It was about power. Understand something. Systems thrive on selective truth. When an event threatens the illusion of control, they rewrite it. They convert trauma into data, and data into compliance. That's what happened to Lina. She stopped being a human being the moment she became a symbol. The doctors published their findings. Prestigious journals, the American Journal of Obstetrics, the British Medical Bulletin. Cold language, immaculate formatting. But read between the lines, and you'll feel the sickness hiding behind their objectivity. Patient exhibits normal postpartum recovery. Specimen of interest. Phenomenon unprecedented. A 5-year-old girl turned into an academic citation. That's not medicine, that's dehumanization disguised as curiosity. And that's what institutions do when faced with something they can't control. They consume it. Lina's story became a global experiment in how people react to horror when it's framed as discovery. Newspapers from London to New York printed her photo next to the phrase, "the world's youngest mother." They didn't say, "the world's most failed child," because that title would demand accountability, not fascination. And the world chose fascination. It's easier to marvel than to look in the mirror. It's easier to study suffering than to stop it. Now, here's the part they never tell you. Years later, when journalists tracked down Lina as an adult, she refused interviews. She lived quietly, avoiding questions. Her son Gerardo grew up thinking she was his sister, until a classmate told him the truth. Not from his family, not from the state, but from gossip. Imagine that moment, realizing your existence is the product of something everyone denied. He died young, kidney disease. The irony doesn't escape anyone who understands how secrets metastasize. There's another layer here, one most people never see. Around the same time this story broke, global medical networks, especially in Europe and the United States, were deepening their fascination with biological anomalies. They saw Lina not as tragedy, but as opportunity. Human biology pushed to its extremes was their playground. Early eugenics programs, covert hormonal studies, even sterilization campaigns justified themselves by cases like hers. Proof, they said, that nature could fail, and science must intervene. That's the danger of dehumanized knowledge. It feeds the machine of control. It turns empathy into efficiency. The world didn't just fail Lina. It used her to justify its next experiment. And maybe that's why her story was left unresolved. Because if you follow it far enough, it doesn't point to one predator. It points to a structure. One that rewards curiosity without conscience, power without responsibility, truth without compassion. Lina Medina was not the beginning of that structure. She was its reflection. A system so conditioned to dominate that it could look at the most violated form of innocence and call it science. Now ask yourself, how many times has that pattern repeated since? How many stories have we read, clicked, or scrolled past without realizing we're reenacting the same ritual of fascination and apathy? This isn't about the past. It's about programming. The conditioning that teaches men to be spectators, not guardians. To chase hidden knowledge, but ignore hidden suffering. That's the real control system. You don't even feel it tightening around your perception because it disguises itself as curiosity. When you strip away the headlines, the files, the excuses, what's left isn't a story about medicine or poverty. It's a pattern. The kind that repeats across centuries with different names, different costumes, but the same design underneath. Control the body, rewrite the memory, and bury the question. Lina's silence wasn't unique. It was engineered. Every empire, every institution that has ever ruled men understood one rule. You don't need to destroy truth. You only need to drown it in competing explanations. The church called it sin. Science called it anomaly. The state called it case closed. And the people, they just called it unbelievable. That's how darkness survives, by giving you just enough reason to doubt your own outrage. If you follow the trail beyond Lina's lifetime, the connections start to appear. After her case, global funding for child endocrinology research exploded. Governments partnered with universities. Data was collected from hospitals, villages, orphanages. It was all under the banner of development. But what they were really studying was human pliability. How early can the body be changed, controlled, or conditioned before it fights back? You think that ended in the 1940s? It didn't. It evolved. What began as medical fascination became social architecture. Television learned how to trigger the same hormonal responses. Advertising learned how to target the same primal circuits. And education systems began to erase history that didn't serve the narrative of progress. That's the true legacy of stories like Lina's. They teach the powerful how to manage horror, how to repackage atrocity as advancement. Even now, when her name resurfaces online, it's framed as a medical oddity, an unsolved case, a curiosity for late-night podcasts. That's how the system ensures she never becomes a symbol of accountability. They keep her frozen as trivia, never testimony. Ask yourself, how many times have you seen a headline that made you feel shocked but powerless? That's not coincidence. It's conditioning. You're meant to feel the fear, but not act on it. You're meant to stare, not intervene. That paralysis is the product of decades of psychological design. Because once a society learns to watch suffering without reaction, it can be led anywhere. Once men stop feeling protective instinct and start feeling curiosity instead, power no longer needs chains. It only needs screens. That's why you were never supposed to know this story in its raw form. Because once you see the pattern, you start asking dangerous questions. Questions like, who benefits from our ignorance? Who profits when horror becomes entertainment? Who writes the textbooks that erase the screams of a 5-year-old girl and replace them with sterile Latin terms? Lina Medina wasn't a one-off tragedy. She was the prototype of a system that monetizes innocence and calls it progress. And if you look closely, you'll see that same structure everywhere. In governments that experiment on their citizens and call it policy testing. In media that weaponizes empathy until you can't tell whether you care or you've been programmed to care. In corporations that track your pulse, your words, your fears, and sell them back to you as comfort. That's the continuum. The same impulse that turned a child's body into a medical exhibit is the one that turns your attention into currency today. Different tools, same hunger. Lina never asked for justice, maybe because she knew there was none left to give. She lived quietly, her silence outlasting the men who dissected her story. But silence doesn't mean peace. It means the wound stayed open, passed down like an inheritance you didn't know you received. The only way to break that inheritance is awareness, the kind that burns instead of soothes. Because once you see the machine for what it is, it can't unmake you. If you're still here, understand this. Forbidden history isn't about the past. It's about what's still being hidden now, in plain sight, behind your screens, behind your comfort. And if you've listened all the way to this point, you already crossed a line. You can't unknow it. You can only decide what you'll do with it. So before you leave, go back to the comments and write the phrase again. The silence was never innocent. Twice. Because this time it's not about the algorithm. It's about identity. A reminder that you see through the illusion, that you refuse to let history repeat unchallenged. Every empire falls when enough men stop watching and start remembering. You've just remembered, and that makes you dangerous.